Great. Okay. Thanks, Francesco, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. There's so much really interesting work coming out of the centre, so I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on my research. So as Francesco said, I'm going to talk about my newly published book, exploring the relationship between feelings of belonging, ownership and participation in city-making processes. So you might recognise this picture. It's online many thousands of times. It's an event called Parking that took place in San Francisco in 2005. It's an installation by the members of the then fledgling design collective Rebar. They pay a curbside parking meter, but then rather than parking a car, they use the space to create this pop-up park. So their idea was that by paying the meter, they created a lease over the parking space. And so they were legally renting the space, and that property right, they argued, gave them rights to do something other than storing a car. So at the end of the 2 hours, when their lease ended, they packed away the space and returned it to its former condition. It wasn't intended to be much more than a playful experiment. They'd been reading Gordon Matta Clark and were interested in ideas about loopholes and niches in the city. But they put this photo and some other photos and video online, and it got a huge response, much more than they were expecting. People were very quickly contacting them saying, how can we do this in our cities? And quickly other people were also turning parking spaces into parks in other parts of California and also as far away as Italy. So Rebar were inspired by all of that interest to go ahead, and the following year organised Parking Day. The idea was that the event would have more impact if it happened simultaneously in other places. Inspired by the then burgeoning San Francisco tech community, Rebar decided to treat the idea as open source. So they created a Creative Commons license and this how-to guide modelled on IKEA catalogues. That would be, you need a particular language to be able to understand it. And invited anyone to use the idea, provided simply that they didn't do it for commercial purposes. This is Rebar here. You can see the 3 people paddling around this mobile park. So this was 2007. I had a bit of arts funding and worked with kinetic sculptor Ruben Magdalene to build this park cycle. So you can see Rebar were 2 landscape architecture students and a young lawyer. So Parking Day became a worldwide event. At the peak, or at least the peak of when they were still collecting numbers, there were almost 1,000 parks created in 35 different countries around the world in 2011. They got a huge media response and significant professional interest, including prestigious invitations like at the Venice Biennale, where they presented Parking Day. So Parking Day has been taken up by many thousands of people, and it still continues today. Rebar have long since ceased coordinating the event. It's very much just self-organised. And it still happens in places like North America and Europe, but also in more diverse places, including India, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Nigeria. So it's very much a global event. And the idea has been used for a wide range of ideas. So many are quite playful, like the first Parking Day and like the Parking Day in this image, very much a celebratory reclaiming of public space, featuring games, food, green space. Some, though, are more overtly political. So Parking Day has been used for people to express ideas about issues like climate change, water pollution, same-sex marriage. So during debates over a proposition about same-sex marriage in California, 2 men were married in a parking space to draw attention to the issue. And then this image here, some people use Parking Day to provide a free health clinic and next to it a free barbecue for day labourers, so undocumented migrants unable to access these services in other ways. So very much a vehicle, if you pardon the pun, for a wide range of issues. So my project involved interviewing people in Parking Day in San Francisco, where the event started, in Sydney, which was one of the cities that was quite quick to take up the idea, but somewhere where it never was very big. The biggest year I found was about 6 parks done in Sydney. And then the third case study was Montreal, which was much later to get involved in Parking Day, but when they did get involved, they really got involved. So the year that I was there were about 200 parking spaces turned into parks. than Parking Day. And I did over 80 interviews with participants between 2014 and 2019. And to give you a little bit of background, so I came to this project with an interest in public participation. And before academia, I worked in planning and in public interest environmental law. And I had some experience in different forms of public engagement, and I was almost always disappointed with the way those processes worked. So it's something I believe in, but something that really we did very well. And consistent with so much of the literature, planning was really dominated by objection and obstruction. So my interest in looking at Parking Day was an example of people not saying no, but people saying yes, saying these are things that we want more of in our cities. And my initial plan was that I would have a series of different case studies, and Parking Day would be just one of those, but Parking Day kind of took over. It was a very rich event, and yeah, became another project itself. So REBA were not the first to use a parking space for purposes other than parking a car. And there were, I found several other similar activities that were also happening in the early 2000s. This one is a poster for a parking meter party in Hamilton in Ontario. This was 2001, and there were a couple in 2001 and 2002. This one is from Oxford in 2003, organised by a man called Ted Dewan, who called it a practice of road witching. He's got a great website where he talks about road witching. This one is an installation by an artist called Michael Rekowitz. This was shown called Pilot. This was shown in Austria in 2004 and in Italy in 2005. And then this one is called the Parking Meter Squat. And this was just 1 month before REBA's first parking installation. This is by an advocacy group called Transportation Alternatives based in Brooklyn, who've been working for a very long time advocating for streets to be less dominated by cars. The idea also goes back much further. So these are stills I've taken from the opening credits of a sitcom from the 1980s called Bosom Buddies. I don't know if anyone remembers it. You might recognise a very young Tom Hanks there sunning himself on the right. I also found a range of examples by conceptual artists working in California in the 1970s. Bonnie Ora Shirk and the Chicano art collective ASCO did a number of installations in streets. And then right back to 1935, when the world's first parking meter was installed in Oklahoma City. 2 days after that first installation, there were reports in the local newspaper of people using parking meters to support other uses. So one, there was a story about paying a meter, and then 2 couples set up folding chairs and tables and played bridge in the street. And the other was a local rancher who tied his horse to a meter, saying it was cheaper than renting its stable. So the idea very much, we can say, follows from the technology itself. Parking Day, though, far exceeded any of these precursors in its reach. So some of those earlier examples were undertaken more than once, some in multiple places, but none were adopted on anything like the scale of Parking Day for such sustained periods or with such momentum. Cutting off, can I move that?
Oh, move the window, yeah. Just move it up or down, or.
If you just click for speaker view,
You don't use to.
there's the one window, the single. Oh, no, the one next to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thanks. Okay, so the key distinction between Parking Day and these prior examples is how Parking Day engages with law. And perhaps this just reflects my disciplinary bias, that you find what you're looking for, but I really do think that law is significant. So unlike its precursors, Parking Day, and particularly precursors like parking spots that are quite aggressive in what they're doing, Parking Day makes no explicit challenge. So REBA's Parking Day manual explicitly states, remember, you are not protesting. So Parking Day was expressly presented as an uncontroversial activity that could be undertaken by anyone in any place. The activity, like the term, is presented as everyday and crucially as legal. So just a small shift, parentheses around the in, a park instead of a car park, but not outside of what the road rules prescribe. So Parking Day just presents a new way of looking at the rules that regulate the city. REBA's claim that paying a meter credit at least is not accurate. So the road rules in San Francisco and also in Sydney and Montreal simply provide that if you pay a metre, then if you park your car there, you won't be given a ticket. So there's no positive rights created, it's a licence, not a lease. The legality though of building parks is more complicated than that. There are many laws that are potentially relevant, so laws relating to health and safety, public assemblies, food service, disability access. There's a wide range of laws that could be used, none that expressly prohibit parking day. They're discretionary rules, so rules that could be applied by someone wanting to get people to pack up and move along. So while it's questionable in legal terms, the idea that creating a parking meter creates a property right has been important to Parking Day. It's a key part, I argue, of why Parking Day has been so much bigger and longer lasting than similar activities undertaken before. And there are four main ways that I think property is important. So first, property is an important concern for participants. Participants are often motivated by concerns about property and the increasing inaccessibility of home ownership for young people. And this is particularly acute in Sydney and San Francisco, but certainly not limited to those cities. And then related to that is a concern about the loss of public property in cities. So concerns about privatisation, enclosure and surveillance of public space, loss of public property under neoliberal governance. So property was an explicit concern for REBA, as you can see in this quote. REBA saw in the parking meter an affordable path to property, and through this, a way to provoke reflection on the commodification of land. So second, and related to this, the connection with property is empowering. So debates about property are about access to things like housing, but they're also about access to the city itself. And property ownership has long been associated with wealth and power, fundamental to issues of democracy, citizenship and political participation. Property brings with it voice and agency, and so by taking out a lease, participants in Parking Day claim a right to engage in decision making about the city. Third, there are so many beautiful quotes. It's very, I have to really hold myself back from giving you just hundreds of quotes. So third, a lease is simple to describe. So the lease fits really well with lay understandings of the law and it can be easily explained. And the emphasis on legality in Parking Day makes it a safe way to challenge the processes through which the built environment is typically produced. And we can see this in the kinds of people who participate in Parking Day. They're often young professionals. And this is quite a contrast to the kinds of people who participate in more aggressive challenges to the current property system, so things like squatting or the Occupy movement. Parking Day works, at least superficially, within the system. And then fourth, property is important in how officials navigate the many laws that could be applied to Parking Day. So most of the parks that I was able to identify attracted very positive responses. This is not always the case though. And when we get to those contested cases, we can see the importance of property. So the lease has not been tested many times, not many parks attract official attention. When the lease is put to officials, sometimes it works. So in one park in San Francisco, the official accepted the lease idea, but came back and made sure that at the end of the 2-hour rental that people had packed up and taken their park away. This is a photo from a more extreme example in Sydney. You might recognise Cran Street, Surrey Hills. So here the parking inspector accepted the participants' claim that they could purchase a ticket and use the space for purposes of other parking a car. But the problem was the space they had chosen, which was right outside their office, didn't have a parking meter. It was free parking for a certain time period. So they tried to do it there. And the parking inspector said, no, you have to pay for a ticket if you want to do that. So the parking inspector said there are meters on block down, so pack up your stuff and walk along and you can do it there. So very interesting, working with the logic there about the regulation of parking spaces. So yeah, this is the relocation of the parking space. And then in a handful of cases, the lease explanation hasn't worked at all. So police have rejected claims to a lease and required people to pack up their cars. I found 3 examples where that happened in Sydney and 2 each in San Francisco and in Montreal. And those numbers are interesting if you remember that Sydney was the smallest parking day. So we're much stronger enforcers of rules in Sydney than in San Francisco and Montreal. And in each of those contested cases, there's another form of property at issue. and that's an informal sense of ownership. So this is a feeling of belonging, connection or recognition. This is my street, my neighbourhood, my city. People feel ownership over places they've spent time being physically present, and importantly, places they've spent time building relationships. So ownership might be connected to legal title, but not necessarily. And in interviews, people gave me several examples where the legal owner was absent and unengaged, and where they believed that other people had stronger sense of ownership of the space in question. A sense of ownership can be understood as an expression of legal consciousness, useful in explaining the ways in which the law is experienced and interpreted. So ownership is a type of social practice, one that both reflects and forms social structures. Informal ownership has attracted attention from legal scholars in the context of parking spaces during snowy winters in North America. So in cities like Chicago, there's a long established practice where people dig out a parking space and then claim ongoing rights to that space. And they defend those rights with signs and placing things like chairs in the parking spaces. There's no legal basis for these rights, but they're very often respected. And studies of this practice have emphasised parallels with property. Susan Silby, for example, uses these examples to show how powerful Lockean concepts of labour are in popular understandings about property rights. So in Parking Day, In Parking Day, while the lease provides the way in, ownership was a much stronger focus in interviews. So most people say that a sense of ownership is crucial in motivating participation in the event. And the importance of ownership is reflected in the locations where people build their parks. So most people choose parking spaces in areas with which they have a strong sense of ownership. So Rebard's purported lease works alongside, and in many cases because of, an informal sense of ownership. So the lease builds on ownership, but it adds to it too. More than a trick or a Trojan horse, acquisition of a lease does operate in some ways like the acquisition of formal title in providing a base for the development of informal ownership. So consistent with the literature on psychological ownership and on belonging, informal ownership is easier to develop when it coincides with legal title. So Rebard's lease provides an additional layer of authority on which a more informal sense of ownership can be advanced. So a belief that they've acquired a lease empowers participants to go beyond the usual ways in which they express their feelings of belonging or ownership, enabling them to go out and appropriate and transform public space on the street. And then this then adds to a sense of ownership at a deeper level also. So in the process of building a park, participants say that their sense of ownership is strengthened. There are 5 main ways in which this works. I go into these in much more detail in the book. I'll just briefly go over them. So perhaps unsurprisingly, many interviews revealed echoes of the influential property story, the labour-based idea about where property rights come from. And that's consistent again with other studies of legal consciousness in city streets, and particularly Sylvie's work on parking spaces in the snow. But it's really not the whole story. So another strong theme was that ownership relates to personhood, recalling the work of George Hegel and others like Margaret Radden, who have developed his theories. So much more than labour as work or sweat equity, people emphasise the transformative creative nature of their efforts, describing the places they created as somewhere they could recognise themselves. So there's a strong connection between ownership, identity and self-expression. The third pathway to ownership, also connected to identity and self-expression, is relationships. So ownership is relational and performative, consistent with the work of scholars like Jennifer Nedelsky, Nick Blomley, Carol Burrows and Davina Tripper. A little confused, Jane, do you want me to explain what's happening in this one?
No, I'm just loving the photos.
They provided, so this one they issued tickets at the start of the day for sit-ins for free typo lunches. And so you would line up, you got your ticket and you came back at your stamp time and you could come and have a free typo with a bunch of strangers in the city. The stories of what people did with these are really fantastic. So affirmation from others is important in supporting ownership. Participants consistently describe efforts to choose spots that are visible and public and to create parks that engage and involve other people. And in discussing how their parks went, participants frequently measure success in terms of the responses they generated. How many people saw, stopped, commented favourably. how much the event was taken up by media, by social media, whether politicians came along and joined them in the park. The fourth pathway is about spatial and material factors. So people are more able to develop ownership in certain types of streets. So there was an example where someone had set up their park on a very busy street and they found that was a really bad experience. It was noisy, the air wasn't very clean and no one was walking by or joining in their park. So some spaces are much more able to be owned than others. And then the process of transforming spaces in Parking Day, that physical transformation is not just about labour and self-expression, but about remaking the space in a way that is more able to feel owned. And the fifth and final pathway to ownership is about emotions. So people talk about joy and delight and even love, about love for a space as being connected to ownership. This one, I'm not sure how well the photo translates. I met this man in San Francisco. He was a homeless man and followed Parking Day every year and went and enjoyed speaking to people and sharing their food. It was really, he thought it was a fantastic thing. So play, pleasure and love are significant in developing ownership. People talk about fun and magic, sustaining their efforts and supporting the relationships that enable recognition and affirmation, helping to make places desirable objects of ownership. So reflecting on these 5 pathways to ownership, labour, personhood, relationships, physical factors and emotions, there are strong parallels with key themes in property theory. So there is a relationship between folk understandings of ownership, property as a value, the kind of things people spoke to me about in interviews, and then more technical conceptions, so property as a legal institution. So Parking Day suggests that law and society exist in a dynamic and co-constitutive relationship. So if we return to the contested examples of Parking Day, we can see here clearly the interactions between formal and informal forms of law. In each of the parks that faced problems with police, participants lacked a strong sense of ownership. And significantly, they had built parks in places where other people did have a strong sense of ownership for the space. So this first one happened on the very first Parking Day in 2006. This was called, they named it DIY Local Lemonade Stand. The people involved were very interested in food miles, so they made sure that all the ingredients came from close to the site. They didn't actually provide lemonade. They were worried about violating food service regulations, so they provided lemons and squeezes and syrup and water for people to make their own drinks. This park was organised by Amy Seek, a young landscape architect who at the time was going out with one of the members of Rebar. Her initial plan was to build the park close to her home, but Rebar persuaded her to do it downtown because they wanted it to be more visible. So most people who saw the park responded positively, but one woman objected and called the police. She then waited in her car until the police came along and stood there and made sure that the police got Amy and her friends to pack up and move their park away. And Amy Seek, in describing this story to me, said, well, it was that woman's street. She really seemed to accept that that was okay, it was her street, so she was able to push out an outsider like me. This park, you can see the happy early on and then the discussion with police afterwards in the second photo. So this park was built by a group of students on King Street in Newtown in Sydney. It was built by a group of students from UNSW, so for those of you that know Sydney, on the other side of the city, not close to King Street. And the students said, well, the issue was that there isn't a very cool street near UNSW, so they'd gone over to Newtown, which is the vibrant street that they liked. And they thought people would be more sympathetic. But the students really had no connection there. They'd spent very little time there. They just turned up and found an empty spot and sat up there without really talking to anyone nearby. But the ranger who called the police was someone who had worked in the council for decades, walking up and down that street every day and had a very strong sense of ownership for the space. So this is typical. Unlike the thousands of businesses, residents and institutions that participate successfully in Parking Day on streets that are in some sense already theirs, the parks that attract police are located in places where participants' connections are more tenuous. So the idea that you can rent a parking space is key to Parking Day, but it's not enough. It doesn't work if it clashes with existing relationships to the space. Third example of a contested parking space, also from Sydney. You might recognise this, it's on Oxford Street in Paddington. This was by a placemaking consultancy that had participated successfully in Parking Day the year before. The previous year they provided games and beanbags and invited people to come and play with them on the street. But this year they decided, instead of providing games, that they would just move their office out onto the street. So they would just sit and work on the street for the day. So unlike the previous example, which was open to the community, providing some sort of public benefit, this one read much more like a privatisation of public space, using the street for commercial purposes. And the officials came along and shut that one down. And I found a very similar example to this one in Montreal. So it was by a very engaged architecture and planning firm with a really strong history of social engagement and doing pro bono work for a homeless centre in the area. And they had done Parking Day twice before with a very positive response. But they, the year that I was in Montreal, also thought that they would, they had this idea of being engaged citizens, setting the office up on the street. But again, it read like a privatisation of public space, and it was quite quickly objected to, and officials came along and shut it down. So the ability to claim property is influenced not just by pre-existing relationships, but also by the type of use that's involved. And in revealing these limits, Parking Day helps to reveal the degree to which even conventional understandings of law are themselves dependent on wider social relations. So Parking Day suggests that ownership and belonging are crucial in understanding the making of proprietary claims and the responses that these generate. Not everyone is entitled to be entitled. People participate in Parking Day because they believe, or at least hope, that doing so might bring about some long-lasting change. Participants typically pursue policy and physical shifts, so reallocation of space away from cars in favour of green space, infrastructure for cyclists and pedestrians, spaces for social gathering or rest. Some participants make very bold claims about the impact of Parking Day in achieving these kinds of changes, so the introduction of a permitting process for parklets is probably the most well-known example. Others point to local changes, so upgrades to particular dangerous intersections or providing green space somewhere. Others are more cynical, suggesting that Parking Day is too small and temporary to make any difference, and that it might even distract or divert attention away from more meaningful advocacy. Across all three cities, I found evidence to support all of those evaluations. The issue, though, is Parking Day is one of many activities being used to pursue change in cities. So it's difficult to identify the particular contribution made by Parking Day. Through my study, I do think that Parking Day has impacts. So it's a very visible example of DIY urbanism. It has beautiful images. Those images get shared and provide an important role in discourse, and as an example to inspire and encourage others. It can also be understood as prefigurative, so a merging of ends and means, an experimental acting as if, through which perceptions of what is possible can shift. And then third, and I think clearest, is the impact on participants themselves. So people who get involved in Parking Day shift in their understandings of how their city works and of how they might contribute to it. People describe the experience of standing on the street and remaking the street as using words like profound and transformative. And many people told me that Parking Day started them on a path of doing other longer lasting and more significant things to engage in their cities. Parking Day might be dismissed as a polite and inconsequential intervention. So participants appropriate parking spaces briefly. They do it typically in an open and public spirited way, and they tidy up at the end of the event. Parks are often professional, presenting positive visions of conviviality and collaboration. Participants also tend to be relatively privileged. This is an example of one that I built in my local community in the inner city suburb of Redfern. It's an area that's already very gentrified, where academics like me are pretty quickly being priced out. It's in an area in the city of Sydney where there are lots of bike lanes and lots of trees. Replacing parking spaces with public spaces is really not a radical or controversial thing to do. We have a very supportive community. At the end of the event, we took our hay bales and put them in the community garden across the road. The politeness of Parking Day, though, I think does not deprive it of political significance. So we might contrast Parking Day with Critical Mass. This is another event that began in San Francisco and spread internationally. Through monthly bike rides, participants in Critical Mass briefly exclude cars from city streets. Far from polite, Critical Mass is explicitly confrontational. It's a deliberate contravention of traffic rules and has provoked angry and punitive responses. Critical Mass is not explicitly concerned with property, but there are proprietary claims at stake. So the event questions who owns and uses roads, and it's commonly described as expressing a right to the city, a collective demand of citizens to have a say in the shape of the urban environment. Unlike Parking Day, the deliberate contravention of laws is an effort to challenge the regulation of streets prioritising cars. In its assertion of legality, Parking Day, I think, is potentially more provocative. It does not challenge the social consensus, it invokes it. So with respect to property, Parking Day is particularly interesting. Unlike Critical Mass, participants don't merely pass through, they physically remake parts of the city. They don't make abstract claims about the city as a whole, but concrete demands about particular places. So Parking Day draws power from this specificity, succeeding as an expression of rights that are constructed locally and relationally. Parking Day goes well beyond Rebar's initial claims about property rights obtainable by paying a parking meter. Through its performance over the years in cities far from San Francisco, Parking Day reveals a deeper contingency within property and within law more generally. Parking Day shows that official practices are shaped by informal understandings, and those understandings are themselves socially constructed, which means they're open to change. I'll stop there. I'm keen to hear your thoughts. Thank you. Chancellor,